I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the partners of the Nonprofit Issues Forum, the Nonprofit Studies Program at Georgia State, the Woodruff Center for the Arts, Southeastern Council on Foundations, United Way of Greater Atlanta, the Foundation Center Atlanta, the Georgia Council for the Humanities, and our newest partner, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We're here to celebrate a number of important anniversaries this year, and here today to contemplate the meaning of some of these events for philanthropy, for civil society, and human rights. It's actually the 5th anniversary, roughly speaking, of this very Nonprofit Issues Forum, which we began in 2008 when Reynold Levy spoke to us about strategic philanthropy. Reynold is now retiring from the presidency of Lincoln Center, celebrating by hosting an $8 million gala. I don't know if any of you saw that big story in the New York Times last week. And so he's certainly showing he knows whereof he speaks with that ambitious goal. And he also personifies the kind of world-class speakers we've been able to attract to this forum over the past 5 years. It is also, as you may have noticed by various banners in the city, the 100th anniversary of Georgia State University, now the magnet institution that holds downtown Atlanta together and which advances the causes of human rights through education of its outstanding and highly diverse student body and its research into the many dimensions of human need and aspiration. More significantly, it's the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and the 150th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that helped set in motion the events that ended slavery and precipitated the first steps on the long road to freedom and equality for all. We look forward to hearing our speaker, Ambassador James Joseph, and our distinguished panel grapple with these legacies and their implications for the future of philanthropy, civil society, and our country and the world at large. And before we get started, I first want to introduce Stanley Romenstein, who is the president and CEO of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and is going to welcome you on behalf of Virginia Hepner to the Woodruff Arts Center, our host and one of our partners in this series.
Ladies and gentlemen, damas y caballeros, buenos dias, good morning, and welcome to the Woodruff Arts Center. I am, as was said, I am very proud to be president and CEO of our hometown band, the 27 Grammy Award-winning Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. My colleagues and I at the Woodruff Arts Center, my colleagues at the High Museum, Alliance Theater, and Young Audiences are very happy to have you in our home this morning for what is sure to be an inspirational time with Ambassador James Joseph. It's fitting that we've gathered in a center for the arts to talk about and think about advancing civil rights in a new era in an era of new demographics, because quite often it's artists, it's musicians, it's painters, it's poets, it's songwriters who lead the way and step out in front when we begin to think about civil society and who challenge our assumptions about civil society. I hope that your thinking will be challenged this morning and your mind stimulated by what you see and hear. So on behalf of everyone at the Woodruff Arts Center, we're glad that you're here. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, and now it's my very great pleasure to introduce Janine Lee, President and CEO of the Southeastern Council on Foundations, one of our institutional partners in this Nonprofit Issues Forum, and she will introduce our speaker, Ambassador James Joseph.
Well, good morning. Well, I have such the distinct pleasure of introducing Ambassador James Joseph. And I will also want to say, good morning, Mary. That's Dr. Joseph's wife, who's with us as well. We had a lovely dinner last night with a planning group and heard amazing stories from Mary. I had the pleasure sitting across from her and hearing stories about their journey to Cape Town and their opportunity to present credentials to President Nelson Mandela. And I was moved and in awe. And when I arrived on the scene in philanthropy about 23 years ago, I started my career at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation in 1990. And when I arrived, I had been working in nonprofits, struggling nonprofits. In fact, I started my career as a drug and alcohol treatment counselor. And I remember bringing in notebooks and pens so that we could take our daily notes. And so when I came into philanthropy, there were moments when I wondered, am I in the right place? Can I do good from here? And when I walked into the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation and I saw the palatial walls of marble and glass, I wondered if I'd made the right decision. But two things happened. The first time I met Mr. Kauffman, when he walked in the room, and he had such humility, and I thought, there's some greatness there. I can do good from here. And the second thing that happened was that I went to my first Council on Foundations meeting, and in this sea of what had to be the peak of membership at the Council on Foundations, at the podium stood Ambassador James Joseph. And I thought, there's greatness here. I can do good from here when I heard his message. And so I've been a student of his for many, many years, and just recently wrote in our newsletter for our membership, which goes out to about 1,500 to 2,000 of our members and grant makers across the South, about Dr. James Joseph. And so I think it's fitting that we take a moment to hear the credentials of this great man. And I don't know about you, but for me, one of the things that I do is I keep in my heart and close to me people that I call the greats, and he certainly falls within that category. So I'll start by saying that Ambassador Joseph has had a distinguished career in business, education, and civil society. Currently, he is a professor emeritus of the practice of public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University and a leader in residence for the Hart Leadership Program. He founded the United States to Southern Africa Center for Leadership and Public Values at Duke and the University of Cape Town, where he and his wife have spent many years, I think the last 17 years, traveling back to Cape Town. And also served in senior executive or advisory positions for 4 U.S. presidents, including appointments by President Jimmy Carter as Undersecretary of the Interior and President William Clinton as U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. The founding chair of the Commission on National and Community Service that established AmeriCorps, he serves presently as chair of the board of directors of the Foundation for Louisiana, formerly the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, and as a member of the board of directors for the F.B. Heron Foundation, known for its commitment to mission-related investing based in New York City. From 1982 to 1995, he was president and chief executive officer of the Council on Foundations, an international organization of more than 2,000 foundations and corporate giving programs. He served as vice president of Cummins Engine Company, the world's largest producer of heavy-duty diesel engines, and president of Cummins Foundation from 1971 to 1977. and ordained minister. He has taught at Yale Divinity School and Claremont Colleges, where he was also university chaplain. In 1985, he was a distinguished visitor at Nuffield College at Oxford University and serves presently as an honorary professor and a member of the Board of Advisors of the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town. After graduating from Southern University and Yale, Ambassador Joseph began his career at Stillman College in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1963, where he was also founding co-chair of the local civil rights movement. A frequent speaker to academic, civic, and religious audiences, he is the author of 3 books and the recipient of 19 honorary degrees. And one of my favorite books is The Remaking of America. His undergraduate alma mater, Southern University, has named an endowed chair in his honor, and the board of directors of the Council on Foundations appointed him President Emeritus, while the Association of Black Foundation Executives established the James A. Joseph Lecture on Philanthropy. I was there this year, as were many of my colleagues in the room, and we heard the extraordinary Bob Ross, president of the California Endowment, receive that award. He is also chairman emeritus of the NHP Foundation, and in 1999, the Republic of South Africa awarded Ambassador Joseph the Order of Good Hope, the highest honor bestowed on a citizen of another country. In 2008, he was inducted into the Louisiana Political Hall of Fame, and in 2010, he was honored by the United States Peace Corps for his lifelong contributions to volunteerism and civil society. Aren't we lucky to have him today? In 1979, Joseph was named by Ebony magazine as one of the 100 most influential African Americans, and later by Fortune magazine as one of America's best nonprofit managers. Today, he has made time on his schedule to share his insight with us, and for that, we're so grateful. There is one thing I want to share from something that Dr. Joseph wrote about President Nelson Mandela that I actually think really describes who he is. And he talked about President Mandela's influence, and he said where it came from. And he said it comes from the power of his personality, the elegance of his humanity, the loftiness of his ideals, the wisdom of his judgment, the calmness of his temperament, the power of his commitment to the well-being of others. And that, I think, describes you, dear sir. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to an extraordinary man, Ambassador James Joseph.
Well, after that introduction, maybe we ought to just go ahead and have the conversation. Thank you very much, Janine. Let me say what a delight it is to be back in Atlanta, a place I have visited many times over the years, and a place in which I have many fond memories. And it's a delight to see friends of long standing as well as make new friends. Now, you notice I emphasize friends of long standing. I used to say old friends, but that doesn't seem to be the correct language. We are meeting today at a time of great turbulence, both in the economic and public life of nations and in the civic and moral life of citizens. To make matters worse, we are a badly divided people, divided by race, divided by religion, divided by region, as well as by color and culture. We live in a time of free-floating anxiety in which the threat of natural disasters and the fear of personal or community violence have become the new normal. This is thus a good time and a good setting to recall the warnings of the great management guru Peter Drucker, who said that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to act on today's problems solely out of yesterday's logic. Everywhere we turn, we hear complaints about our system of governing and that system in the public sector is broken. Others ask, where are the corporate statesmen in the private sector who in other times of turbulence called on their colleagues to help make our democracy work for all of our citizens? Yet, while the public and private sectors are criticized, the nonprofit sector is almost romanticized. Except for an occasional congressional hearing that emphasizes an occasional aberration, there has been very few questions about the potential and limits of civil society. I have chosen to speak, therefore, about the need to rethink the role of civil society because I believe that it is time for the nonprofit sector to lead again. Time to debunk the misplaced myth that intervention in the public life of the nation is somehow off limits, especially the notion that advocacy and direct involvement in social change is hazardous to the health and independence of the sector. Serving as the conscience of our society is neither new nor novel for civil society. American nonprofit organizations have a long history of pointing to shortcomings in public life that have significantly changed the way we meet our responsibilities to each other as a national community. Many of us were involved, and others of us still remember the role of civil society organizations in the 1960s when they served as the national conscience of democracy, going beyond traditional charity and service to include strategic intervention in public life to heal a badly divided nation and to change the society in ways that will allow justice and equality to flourish. Now, while not all Americans endorsed advocacy and attempts to change public policy as a legitimate role for the nonprofit sector, but there is a long tradition of social activism by private individuals and voluntary associations that have shaped public policy and greatly influenced private practices. Many of us are also moved and motivated by the work of civil society in the late 80s and early 90s, as the work of non-governmental organizations helped bring down the Berlin Wall in Germany, contributed to the collapse of communism in the former Soviet Union, and the demise of apartheid in South Africa. But while the idea of civil society conjures up visions of dramatic street demonstrations and other forms of attempts to influence the society, there were always people working quietly and with much less fanfare, fewer financial resources, and less political power to improve the lives of those who were marginalized, discriminated against, and often losing hope. Let me say that I do not have any illusions that civil society acting alone is sufficient to meet the needs of a rapidly changing society. I do believe, however, that rethinking its role and encouraging strategies fit for the times is fundamental to any society that has faith in the essential goodness of the individual. And so I want to propose that while we build on yesterday's civic traditions, we use today's logic to do three things. One, develop a new civic narrative that reaffirms, in many ways redefines, the role of civil society in the making and remaking of our nation. Secondly, help to redesign our democracy to focus on the original objectives of forming a more perfect union. And three, develop and elevate a new generation of leaders who seek power to disperse it rather than simply dominate it. I want to begin with the need for a new civic narrative that is grounded in the assertion by the historian Arthur Schlesinger that the American society is never fixed nor final. We are a nation, he says, that is always in the making. And that is the genius of our nation. Each advocate of diversity has his or her own way of making the case. But personally, I have always argued that the first rationale for diversity is its role in strengthening democracy. Those who wrote the American Constitution did not include people who look like me as full persons in their almost sacred document. But they had the language right when they suggested that if we were to form a more perfect union, we would have to establish justice. And if we were to ensure domestic tranquility, we would have to promote the general welfare. Many Americans who travel or live outside of the United States would also add that the best way to demonstrate the efficacy of our democracy to critics abroad is to demonstrate that it can work equitably for all of our citizens at home. I like the definition of democracy as the ideal that all human beings have equal value, deserve equal respect, and should be given equal opportunity to fully participate in the life and direction of society. I like that definition because it takes into consideration not just the relationship between diversity and democracy, but between diversity and inclusion. It reminds us that diversity is not an end in of itself, or even a private or public good. It becomes a civic good only when it is facilitated by intentional acts of inclusion aimed at not just the sharing of communal space, but the sharing of communal power. It is thus a part of the larger struggle for the soul of our democracy. The new narrative must go beyond democracy and diversity to include democracy and demographics. Public conversations about diversity in conferences and other public forums in recent years always seem to begin with the grand and almost obligatory assertion that diversity is more than race. And in so doing, the discussion is often about everything else but the richness of racial diversity. Let me be clear then, race still matters. This is not a post-racial society, and how we deal with diversity can be a benefit or a burden. The new narrative will need to have a third component, the idea that the notion of a public interest or a common good is not an abstraction, but an essential part of enlightened self-interest. The authors of the book, The Spirit Level, studied inequality in nations around the world and documented how more equal societies almost always do better than less equal societies. The picture that emerges from comparative national research is that inequality is socially corrosive. In other words, there is now empirical evidence that inequality damages social relationships and that measures of trust and social cohesion are higher and violence is lower in more equal societies. And that is the message we must convey as we seek to make democracy work for all of our citizens. Before we can develop strategies that can mobilize a larger constituency to protect human rights and to ensure equal opportunity, we will need to develop messages that will help create a national will. The language of a moral imperative, the idea of a common good, reflects what we are as a people, but we may need to change the narrative from simply helping others to how we, in helping others, help ourselves. Rethinking civil society will also require that we reconcile conflicting images of our civic tradition. E.J. Dionne, the Washington Post columnist, wrote eloquently in his recent book about our divided political heart. I would add that we are also divided by what we proclaim as our civic heart, especially what we claim as the central values of that tradition. Some give primacy to our love of individualism, while others emphasize our reverence for community. But while these two traits in the American character are sometimes in tension, we must also recognize that there have always been this kind of tension. But both of these values animate the consciousness and conscience of nearly all Americans. Dionne goes on to remind us, while these values have sometimes faced off against each other, there is not a party of individualism competing at election time against a party of community. Both are essential to the American story and to our enduring ability to cope with the challenge of change. So let me offer one additional word about the need for a new civic narrative. As the demographics of our democracy are changing, the narrative about the American civic tradition must be expanded to include the civic traditions of the diverse communities that are fueling the American economy and strengthening civil society. Few Americans know that as early as 1598, and long before Cesar Chavez started organizing farm workers, Latinos in the Southwest formed lay brotherhoods to assist members with their basic needs. Few Americans know that long before Alexis de Tocqueville, Benjamin Franklin had become so enamored of the political and civic culture of the Native Americans he met in Pennsylvania that he advised delegates to the Albany Congress in 1754 to emulate the civic habits of the Iroquois. Few Americans know that long before Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail or gave his I Have a Dream speech, African Americans in the 19th century formed so many voluntary groups and mutual aid societies that some southern states enacted laws banning black voluntary activity, or charitable organizations. Few Americans know that long before Robert Putnam published his first article on social capital, Neo-Confucians in the Chinese community were teaching their children that a community without benevolence invites its own destruction. I remind you of this, as I have been reminding audiences for more than a quarter century, to make it clear that it is no longer possible to speak or write about the American civic culture without reference to the very traditions that are now shaping our civic life. But there are increasingly loud voices suggesting that benevolence has boundaries, that our primary civic obligations are to ourselves and maybe our nearer neighbors, those who look like us, think like us, and appeal to our comfort zone. These disparate voices remind me of a cartoon I recall from the 1960s. It was a picture of a boat with a hole in the middle, with two groups huddled on each side, and a group on one side saying, "Gee, that's a nasty leak. Thank God it's on the other side of the boat." Who better than those of us in the nonprofit sector to remind our nation and our communities that we are all in the same boat, and if the boat sinks, we will all sink together. In other words, we ignore the turbulence of our time at our own peril. Let us now look at the second imperative for a society in transition, what I have the audacity to call redesigning democracy, to make it work for all who live in it. We have traditionally thought of democracy as made up of three sectors. But some years ago, Peter Drucker emphasized the need for what he called a fourth sector, a civic space where the three other sectors come together to collaborate to serve a public good. But while a redesigned democracy would provide new vehicles and new opportunities for partnerships, we in the nonprofit sector may have to first make the case that neither a dysfunctional government nor a diminished private sector is in our national interests. While we take pride in the many ways in which voluntarism and the institutions of civil society have strengthened and sustained our democracy, we can also take pride in the fact that the nonprofit sector once enjoyed a bipartisan love affair with government. Just think of how different our life would be if it had not been for the American people acting collectively through government to build the American democracy. What we did together in the 19th century, for instance, to subsidize railroads and land-grant colleges. It was the American people acting together through their government that built and extended highways to not just improve travel, but to foster new forms of commerce. It was the way in which the American people brought electricity to remote locations and used regulations to protect our health and preserve our resources. What a different nation we would be if it had not been for the Homestead Act, water and land subsidies, Federal Housing Administration loans, the GI Bill, and the use of the tax codes to subsidize home ownership, property, and wealth. I cite this because these are examples of what made our democracy the envy of people around the world. But many of these programs that built our nation might not have seen the light of day
if it had not been for the ideas and the advocacy that had their genesis in the nonprofit sector. We can take pride in the contribution of the nonprofit and public sectors, but we cannot look back at the road we have traveled without recognizing the many ways in which the private sector has also contributed to the public good. When I entered business in the 1970s, I went to work for a corporate statesman who understood that in order to have a healthy company, we needed healthy communities. He spoke frequently of the need for capitalism with an ethic. He was concerned not only with making profits, but with how profits were made, who benefited, and our responsibility not just to our stockholders, but to all of our stakeholders. He worked for a more equal society because he understood, long before the publication of the Spirit Level, that inequality distracts from the well-being of not just the poor, but the whole of society. Rethinking civil society will also require that we shed our inherited fear of public life. The delusion that our sector is not only independent of government, but greatly restrained in what we can say and do about public matters. I would argue, however, that public action is often a part of a continuum that begins with private compassion. And I like to use the example of the story of the Good Samaritan to make that point. It is the story of a traveler who encounters someone along the roadside who's been badly beaten, and the passerby stops to give aid. The story is often used to support the notion of a charitable impulse that is triggered by the very sight of someone in need. But what happens if the Samaritan travels the same road each day, and each time he finds someone badly beaten at the same location? Wouldn't he be obliged to ask who has responsibility for policing the road? Compassion requires that we move beyond private charity to the domain of public policy. Redesigning democracy will require that we in civil society affirm and declare as loudly as possible that voting is a human rights issue, and that no government can claim to be a democracy, and no citizen can claim to be a patriot if they interfere or support those who interfere with the right to vote. It means also that there must be more than simply the right to vote. There must also be the freedom to exercise that right. It means that voter education must be more than education about where and how to vote. It must be also about why vote. It must depict and portray the act of voting as not just a civic obligation, but a part of enlightened self-interest that affects the quality of life we enjoy, the benefits we derive from our labor, and the future we provide for our children. Now, this kind of education used to be called civic education, and it took place in the schools. But there now seems to be a fear on the part of some of our citizens that an informed citizenry might change the direction of American democracy. A human rights issue we badly neglect is how we treat the formerly incarcerated. We claim to be a religious people, and there's something in all of our rituals about forgiveness and reconciliation. But we stand by as many states deny the right to vote to those who paid their debt to society. Many deny them access to public housing and even the right to work in areas that they have been specifically trained to make a contribution to our economy. Redesigning democracy also means that we reconsider how we develop programs and provide services to ensure economic security from the cradle to the grave. There is now empirical evidence that a child born poor is likely to die poor. But while we have been very good at addressing issues and developing strategies for the seasons of life, programs for children, programs for youth, and programs for seniors, we have not been nearly as effective in developing intergenerational alliances that mobilize and apply intergenerational thinking and intergenerational action. We hear often that the rising generation is likely to become as demographically defining in the next few decades as the baby boomers were before them. The implication for our democracy is that the two groups could very well end up in a political war for dwindling public resources, with the elderly fighting for economic benefits in order to ward off poverty, and younger people pushing for educational and training benefits in order to avoid falling into poverty. Now, this is a war that need not be fought and can only be avoided if there is intergenerational cooperation in the making of public policy and the shaping of public opinion. Our sector has produced many studies and even some strategies that focuses on the intergenerational transfer of leadership. But very little attention has been given to the development of strategies to draw upon the strengths of each generation. Blinded by the public discourse about the economics of aging, we have been asking the wrong question. Asking, what can we do about the elderly? What should we do for the elderly? When we should have been asking, what can the generations do together? Now, there are those who fear that it would be difficult to redesign democracy to form the more perfect union of which our founders dreamed, because they are persuaded by a warning from the psychiatrist and writer Scott Peck, who said, "We build community out of crisis, and we build community by accident, but we do not know how to build community by design." To those who would forget or ignore the role of the communitarian tradition in building and rebuilding our nation, I would simply point out that civil society has often been the glue that has brought us together and bonded us as a people. In other words, when neighbors help neighbors, and even when strangers help strangers, both those who help and those who are helped are not only transformed, but they experience a new sense of connectedness. Getting involved in the needs of the neighbor provides a new perspective, a new way of seeing ourselves, a new understanding of the purpose of the human journey. When that which was their problem becomes our problem, the transaction transforms a mere association into a relationship that has the potential for new communities of meaning and belonging. In other words, doing something for someone else, what John Winthrop called making the condition of others our own, is the most powerful force I know in building community. When we experience the problems of the poor or troubled, when we help someone to find cultural meaning in a museum or creative expression in a painting, when we help to dispel prejudices or fight bigotry directed at our neighbors, we are far more likely to find common ground. And we are likely to find that in serving others, we discover the genesis of community. So the moral imperative of a reimagined civil society is to help transform the laissez-faire notion of live and let live into the principle of live and help live. So let me conclude with a third imperative for rethinking civil society. It has to do with the need for boundary-crossing leadership. People who can unite other people. People who seek power to disperse it rather than simply dominate it. Strategic investment into a new generation of leaders can help bring new talent into mainstream institutions, equip our sector and the larger society to deal with the new demographic reality, and cultivate civic and social entrepreneurs who are agents of progress in the struggle for equity. The days of looking for leaders with the right endorsements and the right credentials as defined by an established elite is coming to an end. The leaders of the future are not likely to come riding out of the sunset on white chargers, heroes without heroism. Many will instead be ordinary people with extraordinary commitment. Their styles will be different. Their accents will be different, and so will their color and complexion. So we might as well get used to it. In the 1960s, we thought of democracy as a system of government in which the people have the power. We learned later that in many ways it had become a system of government in which the people have the vote, which is not always the same as having the power. In the last few years, we have once again redefined democracy. This time, it is a system of government in which those with the most power seek to retain that power by subverting the very act of voting. How then shall we cultivate leadership for a changing America? A virtual leadership industry has emerged to answer that question. But we are still trying to deal with today's turbulence through yesterday's logic. My personal experience of leadership began at a time when the emphasis in the United States was on the alpha male approach of command, control, and even coercion, what we've come to know as hard power. As a 20-year-old ROTC graduate, I was assigned to lead a detachment in a military combat team in the United States Army. My assignment was called a command, and I was called a commanding officer. It was a time when many Americans were fascinated with the leadership model of a military leader who was assertive, authoritarian, and focused on commanding the behavior of others. Even in our studies of Western literature, the idea of a leader grew largely out of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, an ideal of the brave warrior leading people by example in the Trojan War. But it was while still in the military that I began first to value a style of leadership where the soldiers in my unit followed me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was no surprise then that some years later, after working closely with Nelson Mandela and reflecting on my own experience in business, government, and civil society, I concluded that while the traditional elements associated with leadership were helpful, in its essence, effective leadership is fundamentally a way of being. And so I developed a program and a pedagogy for training leaders that was called Leadership as a Way of Being. There were basically 4 elements to the curriculum: cultivating emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, social intelligence, and what I have come to call spiritual intelligence. These were the 4 elements I observed in working with Nelson Mandela, and they are the 4 elements we need to emphasize in selecting leaders for a nation with our changing demographics. People ask me regularly, how was it that a man who grew up in a rural area in a small country on the southern tip of the African continent became so widely respected and admired that heads of state and royalty from around the world beat a path to his doorstep, seeking his advice on the great issues of the day. My answer was that for him, leadership was a way of being. And Janine has already preempted the core of that answer, but let me say that after 20 years of incarceration, Nelson Mandela went from prison to president. He was in prison while the world economy was becoming more interdependent. He was in prison while we were developing the internet. He was in prison while we were becoming addicted to the cell phone. He was in prison while we were being seduced by the notion that experience trumps wisdom and judgment. But he came out of prison, took over the leadership of his party and his country, and he never missed a beat, because for him, leadership was a way of being, rather than simply the mastery of a set of specialized functions, management competence, or public experience. So let me say again, Mandela's attractiveness and influence came from the power of his personal story, the elegance of his humanity, the wisdom of his judgment, the loftiness of his ideals, the calmness of his temperament, and the depth of his commitment to forgiveness and reconciliation. I wish I had time to take you through why I believe that the future will require leaders for whom leadership is a way of being. But I do want to highlight, as I conclude, two elements that made Mandela so effective as a leader. The first was his understanding that in a badly divided nation, he had to be an agent of reconciliation. The second is that in the midst of wide-scale doubt and skepticism about the potential for major change, he had to be a purveyor of hope. He emphasized the dignity of difference, but he set out to demonstrate that diversity need not divide, that pluralism rightly understood and rightly practiced is a benefit and not a burden, and that the fear of difference is a fear of the future. It was not unlike the teaching of the black mystic, poet, and theologian Howard Thurman, whom I always quote when I talk about the quest of community. Dr. Thurman was fond of saying, "I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you." Can you imagine what the debate about immigration would be like? Indeed, what our world would be like if more Americans were able to say, "I want to be an American without making it difficult for an African to be an African American, an Asian to be an Asian American, or a Latino to be a Latino American." Can you imagine how different our communities would be if more Christians were able to say, "I want to be a Christian without making it difficult for a Jew to be a Jew, a Muslim to be a Muslim, or a Buddhist to be a Buddhist"? That's it. I want to be me without making it difficult for you to be you. This is the message that should be central to our civic narrative, critical to the redesign of our democracy, and a cornerstone for developing and elevating leaders who seek power to disperse it rather than simply dominate it. We look at today's turbulence, and it's easy to retreat to the sidelines with disgust and to say we fought this fight once before and then quietly acquiesce, leaving it to others to fight the new battles. I would hope, however, that we would do just the opposite and say, we won great victories once before, and if history demands that we fight again, we can win again. Like the character in Sophocles' play, It has been the leaders in civil society and those we deploy to other sectors who have held out the hope that someday hope and history will rhyme. I think I hear again these words echoing from the clouds and bouncing off the mountains. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a while, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the other side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. If there is fire on the mountain, or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the bird cry of new life at its turn. Despite the turbulence in our society and our sector, I think I hear the birth cry of new life at its turn. I believe that what is broken in our democracy can be fixed because of what I know about people like you, what I know about civil society. So I hope you will join me in saying both to our allies and our adversary that we won great victories before, and if history demands that we fight again, we can win again. Thank you, and good luck.
That was really inspiring. It's my great pleasure to turn the program now over to Deborah Richardson, one of our local and national leaders. She is Executive Vice President of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, and she is going to introduce our very distinguished and I believe going to be very lively panel to follow up with discussion of some of the ideas that Ambassador Joseph began to stimulate in our thinking.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And Ambassador Joseph, you definitely left us fired up. And it's going to be hard to retain the energy from this panel, but don't worry, we're all going to get a chance to join into the conversation. So I'm going to move to this end of the room so that when our panelists come up, they won't have to try and get behind me in the podium. So as I call your name, if you would please come up and join me here at the table. I'm really pleased with the group of men and women who are here today and the level of expertise that they bring, as well as their commitment to change the society in the way that Dr. Reverend Joseph challenged us to do. First up, Helen Kim Ho, who is Executive Director and Lead Attorney for the Asian American Legal Advocacy Center. Welcome, Helen. Daniel Choi, Chief Operating Officer of East Lake Foundation. Andrea Young, the Executive Director of the Andrew J. Young Foundation. Nathaniel Smith, Director of Partnership and Research for Equitable Development out of the Center for Community Partnerships of Emory University. Tisha Tallman, President and CEO of the Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Leader Abrams, have you joined us? I don't see you in the room yet. Okay, well, when Leader Abrams joins us, we will welcome her up to the podium. Dennis talked, kind of framed the conversation based on what this represents in terms of a historical perspective. Certainly with the March on Washington anniversary coming up in just a few months is certainly a significant one that everyone I think in the room shares some either experience with of hearing about it, so that there is definitely a connection to that. And also the fact that this audience and those of you on this panel really represent the various sectors of civil society. We have people here from education, from business, from advocacy, civic engagement, from the philanthropy world. And it's out of this collective work that we're together as a community to move toward the solutions that Ambassador Joseph shared with us. So I would like to start the discussion by asking the panelists to share something that I consider would be from a personal reflection. And I would just like to quote just a small segment of a speech that was the beginning of the speech that Dr. King spoke during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And he said that when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent word of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men and women would be guaranteed the indelible rights of liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. 50 years from now, we're at maybe a midpoint. So I would like to ask you if you would share with us, when you hear these words and think about the work that you do in the world, how has this led to your passion and commitment for the beloved community that Dr. King spoke about? Helen, will you go first, please?
Sure, Deborah. Thank you so much. And before I begin, Ambassador Joseph, wow, I want to go to school again. I'm just really very, very moved by everything that you shared. Well, for me, I've been a student, of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King from the time I was little and studied it actually first in high school. He's one of my heroes, but another hero, of course, are my parents. And despite what I may look like, I am actually a Southern belle, and I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia, so I really am very invested in one of my core identities is as a Southerner. And I also grew up with very religious parents. My father and mother are elders, my brother's a pastor. So all of these very disparate influences really led me to always think about what I could do in service to the greater community. And for me, that community really was my region, outside of my family here in the South. Basically for me, what's led my passion, in addition to those personal influences, is coming back, making a decision back in 2005 to stop working in large firms and commit myself full-time to nonprofit work. I really felt called to do that. And when I came back to Georgia to work at a Latino civil rights nonprofit law firm, I was amazed at the exponential growth of the Asian community here. I grew up being the only Asian kid in my elementary school, and now in cities like Johns Creek, the elementary school is 70% Asian student population. So our city, the face of our state and our city has changed completely. And when I realized how large this community was, I also realized that this very diverse community is essentially in the dark when it comes to public policy and the issues that are impacting us on a day-to-day level. So really it was an organic process, but through the encouragement of my elders, my first generation Asian American elders who ran small culture groups and heritage groups, they realized, there's a gap in legal service and policy advocacy. And ALAC was really formed through the inspiration and encouragement of the Asian population. I want to say that oftentimes resources follow perceptions, and there's a lot of perception that our organization, our community as a whole has to fight in terms of being this model minority, that we don't need help. Mm-hmm. One of the first things our organization did was a legal services survey, and we found that 3/4 of nearly all the free legal service providers do not serve Asian clients. And the language capacity of these groups are basically non-existent to the over 25% more investment they do in Spanish language services, and that's not to compete with our Latino allies. but oftentimes resources does follow perception, so that's a growing problem that we have. But I will stop there, but that's basically what it is.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate you introducing that point, and we'll come back to that. Danny?
So can you hear me? So I am going to deny myself the interest in reacting and responding to some of the things that Dr. Joseph said, just to answer your question now, because I'm hoping you'll come back to allow us that. But so what I'll quickly say is I want to reiterate some of what Helen just mentioned. My personal commitment to working in the nonprofit sector has actually been my entire professional life. Just as a quick narrative, my personal narrative is that both of my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean. I am American-born, born in New York, but my own narrative is one that's different because I didn't grow up in a New York public school system learning about the contributions of diverse people, specifically African Americans in this country, as only a narrative of slavery and everything else of the sort. And in that ways, it's definitely been an advantage for me in my professional career. One of the things that I would say to you when I hear you read the excerpt that you did is I would say to you that that check, that promissory note, or rather that check was a rubber check, because inherently flawed in that is the assumption that there was an understanding of everyone in this country being human. And I think Dr. Joseph hit on it very well. I don't have exactly what you said, but when you talked about the role of diversity to strengthen democracy, you talk about it at a time when it didn't count some of us, i.e. black people, as whole humans. So in and of itself, it's flawed. I will just quickly say, because I know everybody else wants and needs to respond to your question, that it's interesting for me. So as I think about my America as someone who is American, and we talk about human rights, America has a bad habit of looking at every place else in the world and pointing fingers. So we want to involve ourselves, or maybe not involve ourselves at times, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and South Africa and North Korea, and we're not looking in the mirror and looking at our issues here. So for me, that's what I think of when I think personally of what you offered.
Thank you. Leader Abrams, why don't you come sit next to me, if you don't mind? I think a microphone would be easier for you. And since I've interrupted the flow, if you would just join me in welcoming our Democratic House Minority Leader, Stacey Abrams, to the podium. Andrea.
Well, I grew up in the civil rights movement, and I was when I think of the March on Washington, I think of that it was a march for jobs and freedom. And so in many respects, the legal framework of freedom has been accomplished. But the perspective that the most important thing we can do to ensure prosperity is to create the economic opportunity and to share the economic blessings of this country, not only with all the citizens of this country, but to have a fairer relationship with people around the world, is the other part of that march that we are still very far from having a consensus about. I mean, there are a few people today who would say that our public accommodations, this room, for example, I grew up in Atlanta, so I could remember when the High was not a welcoming place. But the idea that, no one is going to espouse that segregation is okay today. But people are constantly discussing that, for example, the deficit is more important than the employment rate or the unemployment rate in this country. And so until we take the issue of people's human needs seriously in this country, and that becomes our primary objective, we are very, very far from honoring the March on Washington. My senior thesis in college was around the Poor People's Campaign. And so we're 45 years in terms of the anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, where we began to see the first coming together of this diverse coalition. People came from, Cesar Chavez and farm workers came, poor whites came from Appalachia, the welfare rights women representing domestic workers came. We still have nowhere near addressed all the issues of the domestic worker sector. In fact, we've probably expanded it now with so many home care workers that our elderly need that are not getting adequate income. So we've not really taken seriously in this country the issue of economic equity and the right for all people who work to work with dignity, and all people who work to be able to provide a basic standard of living for themselves and their families, and to have all work be work that has dignity and protection. And until we really address that, then we have not fulfilled, come close to fulfilling the goal of the March on Washington, or the last march that Dr. King planned, which was the Poor People's Campaign, to really address the poverty that is the legacy of a country that began only being a democracy for white men who owned property.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Nathaniel, what fuels your passion to do this work?
Wow, that's a great question. Before I get started, I won't belabor my comments about, as well as Danny alluded to what Ambassador Joseph said. The only thing that I will say, Ambassador, is thank you for your comments for so many different reasons. One of the places I really want to start, Deborah, in terms of your question, is really this idea of the importance of courage. We have to understand that when we talk about moving a change agenda, when we talk about deviating from the way things are or the way things are done, fundamentally, courage has to win over fear. The courage to ask the right questions versus being focused on having all the answers. The courage to understand that the oppressor is just as much a victim as the oppressed. The courage to love, and the courage to, in spite of the pressure associated with saying things that people don't want you to say, or doing things that may make people uncomfortable, the courage to understand that what you're doing will actually benefit them as well. And I think when we hear Dr. King talk about this check and the March on Washington, one of the things that we have to understand from a historical perspective is that there was a pressure associated with power and associated with the way things were done that pushed and created a very dangerous environment for Dr. King and the people that played a role in moving America forward to even have the courage, Andrea, to say that things can be better. So that is really where it begins, both individually and collectively, this belief in the power and the inherent need for courage. The second thing I'll say is, and this is just from my personal experience, Andrea knows this as well, so I'm kind of on the tail end of a recipient of the civil rights movement, and my parents were involved in the civil rights movement, and various individuals have inspired me to not only fulfill the work that I'm doing at Emory, but to also found my own organization called the Partnership for Southern Equity. The stories and the narrative, the power of individuals that don't have alphabet soup behind their name, the individuals that are pushing an inclusion agenda, an equity agenda, because it is the right thing to do. Hearing those stories and seeing the sacrifices that they make and their hope for a better tomorrow really inspired me to continue my work. So those are really the two things that really inspire me and propel me forward.
Great, thank you. Tisha?
Thank you. First, I want to thank Deborah, and very honored to be on this distinguished panel and to be in the presence of Ambassador Joseph. Very appreciative of your work and your continuing service and leadership. My passion for working in philanthropy, when I looked, I'm a wordsmith, I'm a lawyer, and I'm a part-time judge, and words mean everything to me. Philanthropy means love of humanity. And certainly I truly believe that in my career, that's definitely been the path that I've chosen to take. I've led 3 different Hispanic organizations, and when I haven't been leading Hispanic organizations, I've been volunteering in our community and really working towards the betterment and the empowerment of our community, our immigrant community, and our general Hispanic community, multi-generational. But my passion really comes from many sources, and it's hard to identify any single source for that, but certainly where I come from is an important component of that. My mother is the daughter and and sister of migrant farm workers from Mexico. Each of my aunts and uncles worked and were born in different countries throughout the state. And Iowa was the last place that a child was born, which was my mother, and that is where they settled. That's the last migrant farm work that they did. So I come from a recent line of immigration to the United States from Mexico on my mother's side. On my father's side, he worked in factories his whole life. He just retired at 70 from working at John Deere and went from one factory to the next. I really consider myself a benefactor of the civil rights movement. Since I've been here and done work leading organizations, I've been in the fortunate position to work beside some of our civil and human rights leaders of the past and of today and of the future. I've been extremely fortunate in that regard. I truly believe that if it wasn't for the struggle and the desire of my family to educate as a way out of poverty and the way out of our situation to create more options for future generations, I believe without that struggle, I wouldn't be here. For that reason, I truly believe that I am a tool. I am a tool, I'm a resource, that my career is to service my community and the broader community for the betterment of all of us. I truly believe in humanity and the love of humanity, and believe that that education that I received is so imperative that I use it for the good. And I feel that I've been able to do that. I feel that the real leaders in my life have been the individuals who have been plaintiffs in the lawsuits that I've carried in federal court on education, on immigration, on workers' rights. Those are the leaders in our community, and I feel it's my duty to provide them with those tools to empower them and to give them voice. And I feel that that's what my calling is. As the head of the Georgia Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, we're still working on issues to provide access for our entrepreneurs to be able to bid on contracts in certain places, to be able to gain access to certain rooms. This next phase of the chamber, I'm very fortunate to have leadership that allows us to move beyond business development and create leaders from our organization for betterment of the good of all of us.
Great, thank you. And Leader Abrams, have you been able to refuel your passion from this past legislative session?
Oh, I'm fine. First, as everyone has said, thank you so much for including me, and my apologies for being late. I was working on my passion, which is government. I believe in government, and I believe in it because I grew up in southern Mississippi. My family went in and out of poverty, despite the fact that my parents had both gone to college. My mom had a graduate degree, and yet often made less money in her job than some of the people who were much lower ranked than she was. My father went to college, but because he had a learning disability that went undiagnosed until he was in his 40s, he was unable to take a lot of the office jobs that really move you out of blue collar to white collar. And so my dad was a dock worker for most of his adult life. And my parents both had come from extreme poverty, so no matter how little we had, they'd done better than their families had. And for us, I'm the second of 6 kids, my parents believed very strongly that they were going to create the generation that broke the cycle of poverty. And I don't think they ever stated it that directly, but there was an intentionality to how we grew up. We went to church, we went to school, but we also volunteered, and because my parents believed in service. And I quote my mom often. She used to say, no matter how little we have, there's always someone with less, and your job is to serve that person. So I was raised with this ethic of service that even when you're little, it doesn't seem like an ethic of service, it seems like indentured servitude. But later in life, it gets you into college on that little column that says community service. And even later in life, it helps you figure out that the degrees that you've amassed were not designed to make you a millionaire, but were designed to steer you towards service. For me, my passion is tax policy. It is one of the most mundane things most people can think of. But what I remind my colleagues of is that where you get your money determines where you spend your money and how you get your money and how government takes in revenue. That determines how we organize our entire life. Government is the single largest corporation on earth. It employs more people, it spends more money, and it has a greater responsibility than any single corporate entity in the world. And yet, as its shareholders, I'm dismayed at how often we exempt ourselves from responsibility. It's the only business in the world where we hire someone and then leave for 2 years or 4 years and hope that they did the job while we were gone. But that's what government is. And so for me, my passion is to not only serve in government, but to make sure government serves, and to do that by making certain that those constituents, those shareholders who hire us, that they understand what government is, what it is not, and what it can do. I've seen the other side very effectively organize themselves in this vein, but we continue to rail against what I see to be the levers of potential power instead of grasping them and maneuvering them to our benefit. Because if we want to break the cycle of poverty, if we want to create better educational opportunities, if we want to change our prison system, if we want to address all of those issues, there is a place to start in government, but we have to be intentional, not just by voting, but by participating, and that's why I stay where I am.
Right, which is a great segue to the conversation I would like for us to have over the next few minutes. Ambassador Joseph talked about that today's turbulence exists because we're using yesterday's logic. And he gave us 3 specific ways in which we can make a paradigm shift. The first one is around developing a new civic narrative where equal value, equal respect, and equal opportunity. So when we think about the work that we're doing in this community that each one of you represent, give some examples, you think, of ways that we can provide some real tangible solutions to shifting this civic narrative.
Well, I mean, and I'll just say quickly and then hopefully create opportunity for more robust conversation about this. I mean, I think the first thing that we need to do is to understand that equity and equality are not the same. And to begin the process of moving away from building success measures around equality and understanding that what we really need to move towards is a more robust conversation about how do we create access of opportunity for all. How do the decision-making structures, how do the development patterns, how do the opportunities for people to be at the table and not on the menu create these opportunities for true equity to be realized? And so the first thing that I think we definitely need to do is to have a clear understanding of the differences between equity and equality and begin to build our success measures and how people are engaged in a conversation around this push for equity, using equality, of course, as an ideal, but understanding that all communities and all structures of opportunity are not created equal in our communities.
I think, Deborah, also that we have an education job to do. We've had such a shift in this country. This summer this spring rather, I was at the LBJ Library, which has been redesigned in Austin, and I commend it to all of you. I think probably the Council on Foundations need to meet there and go and see what was envisioned. And when Lyndon Johnson said, what is a great society? What are the components? What are the measures? What is the behavior of a great society? And really called people to that. and what was put in place that we take for granted today. And I think that for many people, who are post-Reagan era policymakers, really don't appreciate what a tremendous shift happened in the 80s in terms of embracing the role of government, in terms of what we really saw as the fundamental role that civil society and government and the private sector played working together to create a fair playing field. And so when you look at the change, not only the Civil Rights Acts that took place in that era, the creation of national public radio, and television, which is constantly under attack. Why? Because it's responsible journalism that talks about serious issues of the day. The shift in immigration, where we created a more open immigration system, created the student loan program. I mean, these are things, as Ambassador Joseph taught, these are creations of government. These are policy decisions that had a tremendous consensus in this country in the 1960s, and now are constantly under Head Start, one of the most proven programs that we have in terms of changing the trajectory of children who grow up in poverty and who have suffered discrimination. But yet, these things are constantly under attack. So I think we need really to coalesce around an umbrella vision, an overarching vision of what brings us all together. Understand, what is our common vision, whether it's Dr. King's beloved community, whether it's a bridge to the future, that we really have some kind of common vision that all of these things then can be seen as part of, enhanced voter participation, so that voting, is not more it's more difficult to register to vote than to register for a handgun. So what kind of misplaced priorities do we have in this country? How do we really call people to this overarching vision, and then all of these other elements of how we build our community, how we create equity, how we move toward a more perfect union, then become part of, under that umbrella of a new vision.
Exactly. I know, Helen, you ended your first comments around access.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was thinking, just listening to everyone talking, and the example, how do we shift the civil dialogue or the dialogue around civics? And to me, I also believe voting is a human right. I think civic engagement and getting new Americans active in our democracy through voting and ensuring that they can have the vote is essential. I'll just give an example. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial, immigrant, and electorate group in the country. And the South experienced the fastest Asian population growth in the entire country, and Georgia has the largest foreign population in the South. And 4 out of 5 Asians are foreign-born. We are half the size in terms of numbers of the Latino population in our state, but we are almost identical in terms of our voting power. And it's really, I still believe in one person, one vote. It is essential. And I will say, we did voter engagement. Civic engagement is our goal. And there is an institutionalized deprioritization of new voters in our state. There is an institutional lack of desire to bring new voters into our voter rolls. It may not look the way we saw it in the 60s or 50s, but it is there. You have to ferret it out more deeply, but it is there. And I want to say, whether it is fighting voter ID policies or messaging to our diverse communities in a way that inspires them to vote. Let me just give you a quick example. National groups kept telling us when we started our voter campaign, hey, talk about voter ID. Talk about how scary it is and people are trying to deprive you of your vote, so you have to go out there. That fell on deaf ears, by and large, in the Asian American community. If anything, new voters didn't even want to try voting because it scared them. People don't even know what the ballots look like or what the machines look like. That's the level for a lot of new Americans. And so we did a bunch of focus groups. And you know what people said? One senior gentleman said, the only gift that I get from becoming a citizen is my right to vote. That struck me so deeply. Voting is a gift, not a responsibility. Another gentleman who's been a citizen for a while but not been an active voter said, I come from a country where there was a revolution and we almost lost our lives through the power to vote. Why don't I vote here? because I'm happy. Do you ever think people don't vote because they don't feel this trauma right in front of them? And then several people said it's a generational thing. I came here for my children, but they will become the president of the United States. So we began to say, look, you need to model a lot of behavior for your children. You want them to be leaders, you have to model civic leadership for yourself by voting. So messaging and including, ensuring that there's intersectionality of interests, but investing in the different voices and narratives that make that diversity really come alive is essential.
Leader Abrams, in terms of connecting the government with the advocacy, civic engagement community around changing the narrative, what are you thinking about that? And then Tisha, I want you to speak next about the business-private sector.
I have a fairly crass analogy or metaphor for politicians and political leaders. We're like 15-year-old girls. We respond to money, peer pressure, and attention. And if you think about those who are successful in the political arena at driving their agenda, they push those three levers extraordinarily well. Those who are the least effective are the ones who don't recognize that those levers exist. And to change the narrative, the first step absolutely is engaging people as voters. It's articulating for them and messaging to them to get them to use that lever to vote. But the next step is to remember to come back. It's that interim space, and most of the folks sitting up here with me, I've seen down at the Capitol, but too often they come alone. If you want to see change and difference, it's that peer pressure and detention that create it, because often the ones that we're talking about don't have any money. So if we want to use peer pressure and use attention, then we have to identify policies that we either want or do not want. We have to create coalitions around those, and it seems very simplistic, but when you create coalitions around those narrow interests, you actually get our attention better. Because we're very myopic in our voting patterns. We vote based on what we think will get us reelected in a couple of years. And so by using the attention factor to lift up amongst those communities how important this issue is, you activate voters around something they can get. Helen said that voting is a gift, but often not only is voting a gift, but the results of voting are sometimes seen as gifts. And so we have to connect the dots so that the voters, that these constituent groups understand what they could have, and more importantly, what could be taken away. You use that to create attention. You then create peer pressure by getting your allies among your legislators, among your policymakers, and those two pieces together can usually overwhelm the money that's coming from the other side. Because in the end, our job is to get reelected, and that happens best when we know voters care about what we've done and what we're willing to do or not willing to do.
Tisha, the business community, and then Danny, I want you to talk about community engagement.
Right. I want to talk about business, but I do want to back it up a bit because I'm a big thinker, and then I make all the connects and how that gets us to what business should do. But I think ultimately, one of the things I talk about with my daughter who's 12, and what I say to others about my daughter is that I'm not raising a child, I'm raising a leader. And everything I do around raising her is focused on making her a leader. And a leader in my mind is someone who takes responsibility for what's going on in their family, their community, and the broader community. And I think certainly that, we're so worried about educating our children that sometimes gets lost in their creating responsible individuals. And so I think first and foremost, really we need to focus on that with our next generation. And I see all sorts of hope with that in my daughter's generation and how they view society and how it's so much more global than even what we're discussing here today. But because of that, I truly believe in the context in which we are placed, that philanthropy has really evolved even since I've been involved in philanthropy, and the role of government in philanthropy, the role of nonprofits and funding and corporations in philanthropy. And I definitely think that the landscape has changed. A lot of this was due to the recession. Of course, the tragedy of 9/11 changed portfolios overnight for nonprofits. That was the first wave of nonprofits receiving less funding, and then certainly the recession has also impacted funding with nonprofits. We are a nonprofit as a chamber. We're a membership organization, but we really rely on that outside funding from corporations. So, you know, I really think because that landscape has changed so dramatically and because we have seen a lot of our member nonprofit organizations close, it's become so much more imperative for nonprofits to be the plus. You know, they're everything plus, to try to fill the void. I see business as playing a very important role. I think individuals, one, play a huge role, but businesses can also contribute to that. Perfect example, the day after the presidential election, I was out exercising and thinking is the only time I have to kind of really think through some things. And, you know, the numbers in voter turnout following the presidential election were very dramatic for our community, for the Hispanic community. And so my first thought was, okay, we've got double-digit voter turnout numbers, but how do we leverage that? And how can we make a difference with that? Because certainly in the state of Georgia, our population is still half immigrant. So our voter numbers in the state of Georgia are smaller. So, you know, my first thought was, well, leveraging those numbers to provide support and creating leadership in our community is what we really need to do. And so I'm fortunate enough to have some amazing leaders on my board, and it was as quick as making a phone call and asking someone at UPS if they could provide the venue for a leadership conference. And it was not more than 2 months after that from beginning to end, we had a well-funded leadership conference that was not only surrounded around business development, but was around legacy for the community. So not only creating individual wealth, but what can that individual wealth mean and do for the broader economy, but also for philanthropy. So how do we create those leaders and place them on nonprofit boards? How do we encourage them to do that? How do we facilitate and nurture our future political leaders, as we have an extreme void in political leadership in our community in this state? So, you know, business can play an amazing role, and I think they've always played a role in regards to philanthropy and the betterment of community, and we need to continue to think of more ways to leverage that. But certainly I think how we view philanthropy and care and love for our community really begins with the individual.
Mm-hmm. You know, and Danny, you work in one of the best examples, I think, in our communities, our larger community, around how philanthropy, private sector, government can come together for the public good. So you talk a little bit about this shift in the narrative from your perspective?
Sure. So what I'd like to start off by doing is just quickly to acknowledge, much like Tisha did, that I'm someone who's all about language. So I thank you for your broad definition, or your literal definition of philanthropy, because I think oftentimes we have the tendency to think of philanthropy as only the space for foundations. And it's so much bigger than that, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. Also, as Nathaniel defined the difference between equity and equality, that's important. And for Ambassador Joseph, who I'm going to refer to a lot because I deeply idolize him. But when you think about diversity, I think where we tend to get it wrong is we focus on the representation piece. And for me, sometimes when representation goes wrong, it's tokenism. We think about the participation piece if we get to that second piece, but we often don't make it to or don't think about inclusion. So just as you talked about inclusion and the value of that, I'd say for me that there is an interesting intersection between philanthropy, equity, and diversity. I also think it's fascinating that, Ambassador Joseph, you said, because I fully agree, that communities tend to not be built by design, that they are built by a number of other things, whether it be accident or responsiveness. So as I think of the work of the Eastlake Foundation, and we certainly made some mistakes along the way and certainly learned from those mistakes and now can boast about some best practices. I think about the intentionality of having integrated responses and approaches. So for the Eastlake Foundation, that means being focused in community on cradle to college education, on mixed income housing, and on community wellness, which is a host of social services that are wraparounds to really undergird all that. I had the opportunity to hear Nicholas Kristof, who many of you know is a New York Times columnist, speak this weekend at my nephew's graduation, and it was timely. And one of the things he talked about, well, he shared 3 quick examples of a woman in Mozambique, a woman in Uganda, and a woman in Harlem. And what I took from his comments was this notion of talent being universal, and I want to say this slowly, talent being universal, but access to opportunity not being as such. So when we think about how we engage communities, I'm always pushed, and I will continue to be pushed as I think about rethinking this new narrative about what we do, not so much for community, because I think a lot of us think that we're doing things for community, and instead we're doing it to community and hardly ever with community. And that's a huge difference. So as I look down into the audience at our intern, Douglas Peters, I want Douglas just to wave his hand. And I look at young people like Douglas. He finished his undergraduate degree in 3 years and is now working on his master's degree. He grew up as a product of Atlanta and lives right there in the East Bay community. As much as this is an opportunity to engage, for me to engage his talent and for him to do work for the East Bay Foundation, it's a unique opportunity for me as COO of our organization to learn from Douglas and to actually talk to him. So as Ambassador Joseph talks about this new generation or younger, and I'm sure I'm part of that younger as a 40-year-old, I can look at this 21-year-old that I have in front of me and ask him, you know, tell me about your generation and the needs and the access to opportunities. So for me, part of that narrative, again, has to be talking to people in community, and especially in the places that we tend to miss those voices, whether they be youth voices or even adult voices. You know, a lot of us, and I won't ask people to kind of hold the mirror up to themselves, I'm just going to hold it to myself, often we'll do things and we don't think about the role of parents and adults and whole families in the work that we do.
Great, thank you, very good point. Leader Abrams, you have a point you want to make?
I just wanted to tie a couple of thoughts together very quickly, and that is when we talk about the changing the narrative, there's an absence of dialogue around the civic obligation of business. We use the phrase, being a good corporate citizen, but I think too often we ignore the reality that philanthropy is not an excuse for or it's not in lieu of good corporate citizenship. Yeah. And I think often when we think about the business community's involvement in creating this new civic narrative, those corporations that are very generous with their philanthropy are often excused from participation in their active community. And I think it's important as we think about this new civic narrative to talk about how we create this obligation not only to fund good causes, but to be a good company. And good has a very fundamental notion and a resonance depending on where it exists. But if you are thinking about a community, an emerging immigrant community, if there's a corporation that may be kind enough to donate, but creates business environments that create hardship, then that is not an excuse. And in fact, that creates an even higher obligation for our civic narrative to create a space for that debate and that discussion. And I think that's important for all of us across this panel.
And I would like to interject too, to sort of add something to Stacy's list of what our elected officials sort of respond to. That one of the things we aspire to at the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies is that we would begin to have evidence-based policies in our government. And I think that if we could get to a place, where we had a process where people, they state what it is they think many of these measures will accomplish. But what we don't have, just as often our voters don't come back in and visit our legislators after we vote for them, our legislators don't revisit their policies in terms of having any sort of systematic measure or indicator of did it do what we said we were trying to do. And so, if we can get to a place where we are, and I think that that's actually one of the things that the foundation sector has really helped to move the nonprofit sector toward, is to say it's not enough to say we're doing good things. We need to have some kind of evaluation process. We need to have some commitment to really looking at the outcomes and making some judgments about that and revising our approaches based on that. And that's something that, we are not doing, in our government. And I think that's one of the things that allows people to sort of get away with misrepresenting many of the outcomes of government, because we don't before we pass policies, we don't agree on a set of objective measures. How are we going to decide whether or not we actually achieved what we said we were trying to do by spending these billions and billions of dollars?
I want to shift the conversation, and I feel fairly certain that the rest of you, Helen and Nathaniel specifically, you'll be able to respond your comments in this context. And that is to talk about leadership. Ambassador Joseph talked about leadership as a way of being based on emotional, moral, spiritual, and social intelligence. And the examples he gave of that was around business that operated from with ethics and a sense of commitment to the community, political leaders who were not about power and domination, but were about inclusion, and those of us in the civic sector who was about keeping the flame of the vision of an inclusive society. So we think about leadership and the fact that you, the six of you, really do represent this boundary-crossing generational leadership. What are some leadership lessons you think that you want to share with the next generation that you have learned based on your own experiences? So Helen, you were getting ready to make a point, and I feel fairly certain that you can frame that within leadership.
Leadership, what have I learned?
That you would share. That you would like to share.
Oh, that I'd like to share. I think, leadership, it's kind of, I think leadership comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. I'll also kind of be crass and blunt, being from Atlanta and living in the city. I think oftentimes leadership in this airified era philanthropy is seen in a particular way. And there are a lot of assumptions around leaders can afford certain things and they're going to operate in certain spaces when there's not. I'll give you a story of a leader I just met recently. A Burmese man who works in a poultry plant in Jubilee, makes $9 an hour. The car that he owns is probably his greatest material possession, but he offered his car to another Burmese refugee to try and take a driver test, and that poor man accidentally ran into another car on the way. And when I asked him, why in the world did you lend this stranger your car, he said something to the interpreter translated it to me, and one of the things she said was, well, he's telling me a Burmese saying, but basically saying, I'm on the same journey, why not? Those are the leaders to me. He may not be in this room because he's working in a poultry plant making $9 an hour, but this echoes a lot of what people said here. We don't see our clients as our clients, they are our partners. And the policy that we try and develop and advocate for are people policy more than public policy. That is really essential, and I've seen groups and philanthropies fund, $30,000 surveys when what they can do is go and actually talk with people. It seems like there's a fear of actually talking to people, and I feel that there is an unintentional paternalism that often goes on, especially when you're talking about this new rising electorate, the new immigrant communities, and how our work is funded, I think. I think that really needs to be thought about and reevaluate. I had another point before, but maybe I can bring it up later.
Write it down.
Yeah, write it down.
Tisha, when we go there, we just come up to the table.
Yeah, I think the biggest lesson for me is just relationships. And I feel like I've been talking about relationships so much lately. I've sat on panels, but ultimately everything is about relationships. And I think that sometimes when we're in particular roles, that sometimes we don't see sometimes we don't see every relationship as a valuable relationship, but absolutely every relationship is valuable. And the only way that we're going to create leadership opportunities and continue to assist and serve our communities is if we have relationships and if we serve as builders and connectors, facilitators.
Great. Thank you. Nathaniel.
Well, I think one of the things that I've learned in my experiences around leadership and leadership development is I think now more than ever before, leadership is not just what you do, but who you are. I think now more than ever, we need individuals that are just as concerned with becoming the best people they can be. Just as much, that is just as important as them trying to realize change in the community because, to be completely honest, whether people want to acknowledge this, before you can make real change in the community, you have to be just as committed to changing yourself.
I like that.
And I think that, unfortunately, we have deviated from that understanding of whole leadership and living your sermon and separating that from outcomes in the community. And I think that as I move along this journey of leadership, I understand more and more that it's not just about what I say, but it's also about what I do. And that is that is the leadership that people really focus on. It's about what you do and not what you say. And so that's what I've learned up until this point.
Great, thank you. Andrea, your thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, I have the privilege of teaching undergraduate students leadership classes at both Morehouse College and at the Andrew Young School at Georgia State. And my opening and closing remarks is always that the most important virtue is courage, because without courage, no other virtue can be practiced consistently. And that's a quote from Maya Angelou. And so I think that one of the most important things and leadership attributes the essential leadership attribute is courage. Because without courage, you can't speak truth to power. Without courage, you can't take the risks that need to be made. Without courage, you can't say the things that go against, the predominant view that go against the powers that be. You can't give your car to someone who may not bring it back to you whole. It takes courage to lead and to be true to your own principles. So courage is the most important virtue.
Thank you. Danny?
Most of what I learned about leadership, I would say I've learned from definitely my professional experiences, but if I think of my earliest lessons of leadership, it comes from personal experiences and what my late grandmother told me and instilled in me as a young boy. And what I would say to you, what I'd say to the next generation, really to anybody, is that leadership is tough, but it's necessary. Understanding the perspective of others who are not like you, whether that be race, opinion, whatever it may be. So I love what Ambassador Joseph said about finding the space of being yourself and allowing others to be who they are. I've learned probably as early as third grade that you can lose friends, but it's important to do what's right or what you think is right and to live your truth. I would say to people on my staff, and Cornisha Scott I think is somewhere in the audience here, but I always say it's important for leaders to know when to lead and to know when to follow. And some of the best leaders are those who know when to lead and when to follow. I would say it's best when leadership is proactive, but sometimes circumstance causes that to not be possible. I'd say in those instances it's better to be responsive than reactive. And the last thing I would say is something that Ambassador Joseph shared many, many, many years ago when I had the opportunity to hear him speak to ABFE, the Association of Black Foundation Executives and the Council of Foundations, where he talked about never losing your sense of outrage.
Yeah.
And I know I didn't do a good job of answering the first question about passion, but a lot of my passion comes honestly from him and from what he said about knowing that when everything is right for me and I can look around, and Dr. King said this in one of his famous quotes about injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere, leadership takes courage. It takes courage, and in this environment, as a younger professional, you can make it or break it, as they say here in Atlanta, depending on what you say and who you say it to. But you absolutely have to speak out when you know something is wrong.
Thank you. Helen, you said you remembered what you wanted to say.
Well, it's actually tied to an earlier comment that Stacy made and Andrea made, and in a role that I think philanthropies can really play in being leaders for our city, which is, elected officials, it's true, they make a lot of their policy decisions on, short-term election-based strategies, but what ALAC tries to do, and I think what philanthropies can really help in, is that long-term vision of what are systematic or systemic changes that from a long-term perspective helps our entire society thrive, and investing in that and truly investing in that. And I'll give you an example. The UGA's Selig Center did a study, I think it was the Selig Center, when they look at who is making up our 0 to 10 children population. It's immigrant children. But think about the education policies and the general education policy, and these are my allies, so I'm not being critical, but are our policies really thinking about immigrant children now, so that we're not looking at our policies 20 years from now and looking at them more as charitable social service issues, but as empowering those parents and children right now, getting them civically engaged, being thought leaders right now, and investing in the policy changes that need to be made so we can be responsive, not reactive on the back end when it's too late. So I think that's something I wanted to say. And then also in terms of leadership, I'm also a younger leader, I guess. I'm a Gen Xer, but we have a lot of interns and fellows that could be, if I was a teen mom, they'd be my children. It's amazing. I learned so much from them, and my greatest lesson comes from them, and that's let go. I see a lot of groups say, we want young people, but then they create their own program, and they want the young people to volunteer into what their ideas are. That's not going to keep them there. Right. Let go. We're creating a Young Leaders Council, and they said, what do you want us to do? I said, what do you want to do? Mm-hmm. You let me know, because you inspire me, you inspire our group. You're thought leaders to me, right, not just a group of young volunteers.
Right. Thank you. Leader Abrams on leadership.
So I would say three things. One is that leadership has to create value, not look for validation. And that's very hard, especially, and I want to take a quick aside. Politicians are good people by and large, and we do think about things in a broad way, but usually when you're at a place like this, you're trying to figure out how you deal with the other ones, so that's really my focus. But one, it's using leadership for value and not validation. The second is that you meet people where they are, not where you want them to be. Mm-hmm. And whether it's generational transfers of leadership or it's inclusion, it's figuring out how do you get to their space, not how do you make them come into yours. And I think that's part of what Helen was articulating. Mm-hmm. But the third one that's most important for me in my current role, I'm the minority leader. My job is to lose well. Because if I win, it's because the other side has really screwed up. And so learning to lose well, lose effectively is very important because it creates a space for opportunity for the next challenge. I may not win what I want the first time, but if I can create incremental gain, even if I don't get everything, or even if I fail, if a bill that I rabidly dislike passes, if I've been able to mitigate its impact in any way or raise awareness about its impact, then that creates the space for Andrea to come in with her empirical evidence, or Tisha to come in and bring her corporate community in. It creates the space for the next conversation. So leadership has to learn that success is not simply about winning your objective, it's also about losing well so that you remain able to engage and compete for the next time.
Thank you. I would like to shift to have a conversation with those of you in the audience. Ambassador Joseph, will you please join us up on the stage once again? I'm going to give you my microphone. And we have microphones here on both sides of the room. Would you, those of you who have questions or comments, will you please come up? Sit next to Tisha.
Okay, thank you. So, Ambassador Joseph, in the beginning of your comments, you talked about there being a time when nonprofit leadership was really the consciousness of society and a democracy, and that we really needed to be able to move beyond just charity. So that's the context in which my two questions are going to come from. So I do believe that there's sort of a pervasive belief among nonprofits, particularly service providers, that we're the good doers, but that the contribution, it's nice to do, but that we haven't really clearly defined like our economic impact and the fact that we really do, that this is a necessity, it is not a nicety to have this type of work going on in the community. So my first question is, how do we help the philanthropic community, and particularly nonprofit service providers, courageously sound their voice and embrace their rightful role as leaders and contributors of society? So how do we shift that consciousness? That's number one. And then the second question is, how can we utilize tools or interventions, strategies, okay, like social enterprises as a means of not only becoming financially self-sufficient, but as a means of building the economy in local communities, dispersing power, and modeling responsive and responsible business leadership, corporate leadership?
Let me start with the latter question, because
I recognize that I talked about the fact that it was not in the interest of our sector to have either a dysfunctional government or a diminished private sector. And I made the case for what I call the bipartisan love affair that we used to have with government. But I didn't talk much about business. And I spent a significant part of my life in each of those sectors. And I just want to add something about the business part of that question. Many corporate executives and members of boards of corporations think it is sufficient to say that we have done this in philanthropy. We have a corporate giving program that does that or the other. One of the things I learned when I became a corporate officer of a transnational corporation, and the first job I had before that was heading the foundation. And I thought that we did a lot of wonderful things, millions of dollars. But as I advanced in the corporation and had larger responsibilities, I began to realize that the decisions we made about where to locate a plant, the decisions we made about what to pay the workers, provided more of an impact on the community than the dollars we spent in philanthropy. And so for those who are raising the question about the role of a corporation, I like to put it this way: a responsible corporation is one that locates a site responsibly, hires a workforce responsibly, pays wages responsibly, uses the return on investment responsibly, engages in the community responsibly, works with government responsibly. And that's what we want of business. Not just a marginal contribution at the end of the year, which doesn't even affect their profits, but we want a responsible corporation that does all of those things. And when I used to say that to business leaders, they'd say, well, you're with Cummins Engine Company and you guys do it differently. I said, but we still produce the best diesel engine in the world and we still make a profit. But the emphasis for us on how the profit was made rather than just making the profit. So I think we need a new language and a new model of what it is we are seeking and saying to business, you need to be responsible citizens. And so that's what I would say now. I almost forgot the first question. I probably should have taken it first.
Just how do we shift the consciousness of the philanthropic community, the nonprofit service providers in particular, so that they really understand the contribution that they make and they raise their voices in order to be the leaders that you're really asking us to be?
Yeah, well, you know, I was in philanthropy longer than I've been in government or longer than I have been in business. And I'm a critic of philanthropy. When I was president of the Council and Foundation, I was a critic as well as a servant. And I happen to believe the best servant is the one who's willing to be a critic, and the best critic is one who's also a servant. And so that's how I live my life in each of those sectors. In terms of philanthropy, there was a time when, in the 60s particularly, we had some foundations that were willing to take risk. We can't find many foundations anymore that are willing to take risk. And panel talked about courage. And we can't find many people with courage. Now, how do you change that is the $64,000 question. And we used to have, when I was president of council, we used to have an orientation for new staff. And I used to worry about the arrogance of the foundation officer. And I used to say that if you remember but one thing I said to you and whatever I said in orientation, is that you need to check your arrogance quotient from time to time. And because one gets accustomed to having people praise their ideas because they have your money, rather than because they necessarily like your ideas. And so foundation executives suffer from this disease of arrogance. And so given that wall of arrogance, it's very difficult to penetrate it and get at the heart of the problem, which someone was talking about, the need to intersect with the people in the community. But foundations tend to have little boxes that they have decided are their priorities. And when they meet a big idea that doesn't fit in the box, they're not sure what to do with it. And so they will try to fit your idea into one of their boxes rather than have your idea change the way they do things. And so I think we need people from within the field of philanthropy, including both foundations and the rest of the sector that we call philanthropy, who are willing to speak out to their colleagues, because it's very difficult for them to listen to those folks who are on the outside, unless we do it in dramatic ways that embarrass them. And so what we need is the ability to put pressure or to persuade people on the inside to talk to their colleagues the way some of us used to do, like when we formed the Association of Black Foundation Executives to do that. And I think inside folks, well-placed, have to probably do that, and you need to put pressure on them to do that. When I became president of the council, a few years before that, I had been a critic of the council. But I said to the Association of Black Foundation Executives, now that I'm president doesn't mean that you stop putting on the pressure. I need you to continue to put pressure from the outside so that I can say, it's not just me, but there are all these people out there demanding that this happens. And so I think we need to infiltrate the field with people who have the kind of feeling, the kind of values that you're talking about. And I'll stop by saying, a lot of my students who care about changing the world decide that they are going to go into a change organization, whether it's an alternative to the traditional and the orthodox, or whether it's an orthodox change organization. And I say, why don't you go into a place that is not known for that and find the space to use the resources of that organization or whatever to do what you want to do. When I went to business after being a leader of the anti-war movement in Southern California, and people were stunned. And I say, what's important to me is to be able to have the resources and the space to act on my values. And I think I've found one company where I can do that. And so I'm not changing my values. I'm not going back on what I've been saying and doing. I'm just trying to find a new arena to do it, because there are lots of people who can do what I've been doing. And I think we need to think like that, is that we go in to the traditional institution as well as the non-traditional, but we shouldn't lose our values. And if we don't lose our values, then we act on those values wherever we are. And that's what I think is important.
Just one quick question. How you doing, Ambassador?
Fine.
Just a quick question on, could you just talk a little bit more about the intergenerational and how you go about the space of creating those opportunities? And the reason I raised the question is because we are going through this large demographic shift, and there's going to be a huge need for more inclusion that you spoke of earlier. But what are some of the opportunities within the space of philanthropy, as well as the nonprofit sector, that creates these occasions to interact?
Well, I think from the foundation sector perspective, we need to see more funding with incentives for organizations to try to do intergenerational work. And from the outside, we need to make the case, as I tried to do in a very quick fashion, that the problems we face, economic security, we should promote from the cradle to the grave. And I said that what we've done well is to have programs that work on the seasons of life. We need to find ways to say, okay, if a child born poor is likely to die poor, how do we develop programs? And we need to make that case to foundations because they are not making it themselves. And we also need to make it to the community. And I liked what someone said about developing a program and bringing the young people in, as opposed to bringing the young people in and saying, what would you have us do? I think so the perspective you take and your whole mindset in trying to get young people to collaborate has a lot to do with whether you'll be successful or not. And so part of it has to do with changing the mindset that we've got this good idea that we want you to come help us work on, rather than saying we want to hear your idea of what we ought to be doing to better achieve our mission. And I'm going to be brief because there are other people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, I did. I just wanted to comment on the corporate giving, because in our context, we have a C6, a C3, and we just created a political action committee. So, and then we made the C6 a supporting organization of the C3 so that we could give to our C3, okay? If that's, we've done some things so that we can effectuate the change that we want to see. So instead of relying on corporate foundation money, we take very little corporate foundation money for the C3. Instead, we fund our C3. And we do that for a number of reasons. But there are options within that corporate foundation world. We have relationships with corporate, different departments in corporations more than we have relationships with corporate foundations for the exact things that the ambassadors was speaking about. If you have a vision, you can get it funded, but you have to not only have that vision, you have to have a way to implement that vision. And there are fantastic people in the corporate world, and that's why relationship comes up again. It's so incredibly important to establish relationships with those people that and learn about the corporations and the corporate structures and who has funding and who gives funding for what. But we get funded by all sorts of sources within corporations, not just the corporate foundations. There are marketing dollars. There are community dollars. There are so many other resources to go after, and we've done that in order to get those innovative programs that we really want to establish funded.
Hi. My question has to really do with the environment, in a sense. In light of the drastic and often violent and rapid shifts that is occurring in our ecological systems and affecting the balance of wealth, not only here but in the world, how do you see philanthropic organizations challenging corporations around the world, while at the same time being sort of tied to corporate strings for charity? How do you see these organizations being able to assist populations around the world in dealing with a lot of the corporate greed that is affecting the quality of life for other people around the world? And do you think eventually we in America will begin to experience some of those life-changing issues due to the disruption in our environment?
Well, I think you have to begin about the way you think about the role of corporations. And we don't think, well, we talk about it, but we don't think strategically enough about what we do about the way in which corporations impact on the environment. And so we need to start including that behavior in the hierarchy of civic virtues that we talk about. Secondly, I think we have to approach business with a little more pressure than we do about the impact. When we go, we usually are talking about the impact on the social environment and never on the natural environment. I spent 4 years in the Department of Interior, as some of you know, and part of my responsibility was for
land management and water resources, et cetera. And people said to me, why are you going into the Department of Interior rather than one of the social service agencies? And my response was that the word justice ought to include the natural order as well as the social order. As a matter of fact, I once taught a course in which I tried to get the students to think about what justice means in relation to the natural order rather than simply thinking about it in relation to the social order. And so I think we need that kind of thinking. What is our responsibility to the natural order as part of the social order? And once we do that, then we have a basis for talking to corporation about the responsibility of both the social and natural order. In terms of how do you bring pressure, I assume every organization and every individual has to decide what is likely to work in that setting. But as I started off by talking about a new narrative, I think we need to have almost a new language for ourselves as well as for our encounter with business executives about the role of the corporation in relation to environment.
Good morning.
Morning, good morning.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is in terms of the issues of cultural equity. I was really, really pleased to hear the framing this discussion in terms of there was a difference between equality and equity. I come from the arts and cultural nonprofit community, and for 30 plus years we've been struggling with this issue of cultural diversity and cultural equity. And for cultural communities of color, it's always been about cultural equity. It is a human rights issue, and I think that there is something in the Declaration of Human Rights that says that the right to one's culture is a basic human right. And we don't really address that issue. In Georgia, if it is Atlanta is the 21st century. It's not becoming, it already is. The question is, how do we connect these issues of cultural equity with this larger issue, not just of philanthropy, but of human rights? Because someone from the cultural community, an artist, should be sitting at that table as well. The other part of this is that I know in 2012, the National Committee on Responsive Philanthropy published a study about funding in the arts and culture realm. And in 2009, there was $2.9 billion given to arts and culture. And more than 60% of that went to the largest, whitest, wealthiest institutions. That is an issue of cultural equity. How do we enlarge this discussion and connect my part of the field with your part of the field?
Well, this is a good opportunity to bring the panel in.
Well, you know, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think that you raise a very important issue, and you can't be respected as a people if your culture is not respected and if your culture is not visible. And and I think it is an ongoing issue, and it's something that in this city, really was, Maynard Jackson took on as part of the electoral process. When he came in, he started the first cultural, Department of Cultural Affairs. He used CETA money to fund neighborhood art centers. And so in Atlanta, we have had a tradition of promoting the arts, Michael Lomax in Fulton County. Absolutely. But under these current economic conditions in the state, I think the Georgia Council for the Arts was almost zeroed out in terms of a budget. So it is an ongoing battle, and one of the things that has not been understood is that part of what makes Atlanta a magnet for talent, for the talented class, the job creators, whatever you want to call them, it has been the arts tradition, and that there is a relationship between a dynamic arts environment and your economic environment. And I think the other point, from Dr. King, he talked a lot about that we have substituted the means of life for the ends of life, that our culture is the center of life, and that, we in Atlanta, we're very business-oriented, we're very money-oriented, and we have not had, some of that rich tradition in our business community of really valuing the arts at the center. I think right now the Chamber doesn't even have the arts as one of its economic development strategies. So you raise an excellent point.
I would add one piece to this. I think we have to
we have to recognize that Georgia is not Atlanta, and that this dialogue has to be broader than Atlanta. The state of Georgia makes economic decisions based on what priorities are put before us, and we value what we see. 2 years ago, there was an incredible push from the arts community for a tax that would allow that fractional tax. And, Joe Bancroft, Virginia Hefner, they were down in the Capitol, and when that didn't work, people sort of faded away. Part of that was simply the atmosphere didn't seem to lend itself. But what I would point out is that the groups that are successful don't give up when they don't win.
That's right.
But more importantly, the coalitions and the allies have to start to look different. They have to start to look like the state. Joe and Virginia are wonderful allies, but they need to see you at the table. We need to see you at the table, because I sit on the Ways and Means Committee. We make the decisions about the money that's going to be allowed to be allocated by appropriations. So if we don't know that this is an issue, if we don't hear about the disparity, and this again ties all these components together, the attention has to come from you and from your organizations, in part because we have to remember we have part-time legislators who prioritize the thing they know. And most of us are not artists, and we have a vague principle that's beyond our own. And so I think that the opportunity to change the dynamic of the narrative here is to do what they did so effectively in Minnesota. Minnesota has an incredibly aggressive arts lobby that spends its time down at the Capitol and keeps it front of mind, because they've been able to connect the dots between economic development, not simply for Minneapolis, but for the entire state. And when we think about the arts and culture, we have to think about South Carolina, we have to think about Southwest Georgia, we have to think about all those component pieces, but they have to be brought together for us as legislators so that we know the consequences for our inaction are not simply that we disappoint a community, but we disappoint an economic driver who could improve the quality of the state.
Deborah, if I may, and this is just quick because I want to add another angle, if I may, about this arts question. You know, it kind of veered in the direction of lobbying and funding for arts programs, but I think it's also important to historically understand the importance of the arts and culture in being an instrument for social equity and change. And that's really what I want to make sure that we lift up, that the arts in our culture, historically, when you're talking about not just being successful at a campaign, but actually building a movement, have played a critical role, whether it be the Harlem Renaissance or whether it be other examples of people like a Zora Neale Hurston or people like a Paul Robeson or individuals who really use the arts as a backdrop and a conduit for policy change and social justice. And so the reason why I lifted that up is I think that a lot of times when people are doing equity work, just like young people are sometimes forgotten, I think sometimes we forget the importance of the arts in providing that platform and that mirror that you talked about, Danny, for people to understand that we all do better when we all do better. And I think that it's important for us to reimagine that and embrace that again and really begin to look at culture and the arts as a tool for social equity and justice and really create those tables for those conversations to happen.
Ambassador Joseph, you challenged this room to engage in a new sort of dialogue about civic engagement. And I listened to the panel and was struck by a wild power imbalance that exists in our culture. That is, we live in the age of Citizens United and money is speech, according to the Supreme Court. The amount of money that folks who do not hear this narrative have available to them to bear on what our public understands about the role of government and civil society in their lives is wildly different now than it used to be. What the panelists spoke on was how to go person to person, how to reach people who have pain in their lives, who have needs. They did not speak, aside from Stacy and Leader Abrams, who said, I'm terribly cognizant of the money that exists in this conversation. How do we get to that place where that balance of power is somehow altered? And I think it's in the language that you're bringing, I think. But I'd love to hear more about that, because that's a new challenge from the 60s that didn't exist then.
Well, if one wants to probe this more deeply and say, why are we at this point? I think I would suggest that whereas we as a society and as a democracy used to manage a market economy, we have become a market society. And it's not just that people are telling us that we ought to operate our organizations according to business practices, we ought to do this or the other. It's just that the way we think now as a people have come out of the notion of a market. I was reading recently where even a place of incarceration in California, you can, if you are incarcerated, you can pay a special fee and get a better cell. I mean, that's how far we have gone with the market orientation towards the way we do business. And so I don't think we're going to deal with that unless we stop and look at what we have become as a society and how our values have shifted. There used to be a time when we had an issue, we'd look to religion, we'd look to philosophy, or we'd look to the social science. Now we've been told we look to the market because that's where the answers are. We cannot continue down that philosophical direction as a society. So somehow we have to start dealing with this in our messaging, whether it's from the pulpit or whether it's from social media or wherever it's from. We somehow have to change this way of thinking and the way we do business, in which everything is for sale. And that the only and the primary virtue is that there be a willing seller and a willing buyer. That's the mentality in which we now live as a society. And so we've got to tackle that head on. And I think we have to use all of the avenues for communicating and messaging that we have to make that point.
So Deborah, can I quickly add to that? I've been dying to say this. So I'm glad that you said what you said, because for me, what's interesting, especially as we look at the anniversary of the March on Washington, I think it becomes easy to think about the role of government. It becomes easy to segregate and isolate and think about the role of philanthropy and to think separately about the role of corporations. And I think for me, where I don't know if this is my idealism that's waning as I get older. I don't know if this is because like Ambassador Joseph, I'm a critic, and I think we tend to critique the things that we love and care most about, so we don't critique the things that we don't care about. But I'm a critic of foundations and the fact that foundations oftentimes can be risk averse when they have the most ability to innovate and really take some great and prudent risk. But what's interesting to me is when I think about two quotes, Dr. King's quote around everybody can be great because everyone can serve, and the Margaret Mead quote that most of us know, never doubt that a small group of committed, thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So when I think about, you know, those critics who say that you can't decentralize and put power in the hands of the people, that it has to be all these others that we leave the responsibility up to, I think a little differently. And I think where's the space for maybe philanthropy to think a little differently about its role? When you look at the 2010 giving for foundations that gave to education, you probably wouldn't believe that it made up in 2010, and given, I realize the recession that we were in, less than 5% of what was spent on public education, less than 5% in the United States came from foundations. The largest, like Stacy mentioned before, government is where it came from. I'm marveled by the fact when Stacy talks about, and I've heard her say before, as an elected official, tell me what the problem is, don't assume I know the issue, tell me specifically what you want me to do. As citizens, we disengage in that civic engagement process. So it's disheartening to hear that sometimes elected officials are making decisions based on the 2 or 3 emails that they may get because people aren't wholly writing to them and saying, hey, I put you there, I can make sure that you don't get back there because I elected you to be engaged citizens. So again, in closing, as I think about what Dr. Joseph said about developing a new narrative of a civil society, helping to redesign the principles of our democracy to form a more perfect union, and developing a new generation of leaders who seek to gain power, to disperse it rather than to keep it or dominate it, I have to think of my role as an individual and as a citizen, which doesn't at all abdicate responsibility for any of those other 3 sectors, but it says that I realize a level of personal responsibility in building what I hope to see for the future.
Yeah, could I just offer a closing comment? You know, we as true servants have spent a lot of time criticizing what we love. And I'd just like to leave on a very optimistic note. I always like to quote Václav Havel in my speeches at the end, and I didn't do that today, so let me just use that as we close. He said, I'm not an optimist because I do not believe that everything ends well. I'm not a pessimist because I do not believe that everything ends badly. But I could not accomplish anything if I did not have hope within me. For the gift of hope is as big a gift as the gift of life itself. And so as a sector that provides help, just know that in providing help, you're also providing hope. And the gift of hope is as big a gift as life itself. So congratulations on all the great things you do.
Maybe I'll just operate from down here. It'll be a little easier, and I'd like to do that because please just remain on the stage for a moment, and I'd like all of us to thank our speaker and our various commentators. I think they've led us in a wonderful discussion, and a very meaningful discussion this morning, and I want to thank each and every one of you for contributing. So. Let me just make a few concluding remarks. I think we've witnessed today that this Nonprofit Issues Forum can serve an essential function for Atlanta, bringing together the various elements of our civil society in a high-level and neutral forum with world-class speakers and community and academic leaders to discuss the critical issues of the day and the directions for tomorrow. That's why we have this Nonprofit Issues Forum. It's become a growing partnership. It started with a conversation between me and Joe Bancroft and Milt Little when we first brought Rental Levy here in 2008. We've gone from 3 partners to 6 partners, as you know, and we hope in future years that this partnership will expand and hopefully command the resources of the Atlanta philanthropic community in a manner that I think something like this so richly deserves. Just to let you know, the partners in this forum will be getting together for discussions this summer, and we welcome your input on that and on how to make this a permanent part of the dialogue in Atlanta's civil society landscape. Meanwhile, I've got some thank yous as well. I want to thank the Georgia Power Foundation. I don't know if Susan Carter is here yet right now, but for supporting today's program. All of the NIF partners, NIF, I use Nonprofit Issues Forum, for their both in-kind and financial contributions to making this program possible. And certainly a number of unsung individuals whose efforts this program, without whose efforts this program would not have been possible. These individuals include our good friend Patty Johnson. Many of you know Patty. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to come this morning after having done yeoman's work in putting things together. Elise Kovar, Joan Kepix of the Foundation Center, Aisha Alvarez. Everybody's probably run into Aisha keeping this going. She's has been with the Southeast Council of Foundations this year and is completing her degree in higher education administration at Stony Brook University in New York. Marianne Gordon, Tamika Williams, Matt Durrance, Lauren Klein. I hope I haven't missed anybody, but when you put on an event like this, a lot of people contribute, and I'd like them all to receive recognition. I'd also like to conclude with kind of a mini commercial. We have 2 partners. The two other major research universities in the Atlanta area, along with Georgia State, the Georgia Tech, and the University of Georgia, offers the Executive Leadership Program in Nonprofit Organizations, a one-week intensive course focused on how to learn the skills and perspectives needed to lead our nonprofit organizations. And we have our sixth annual session coming up. And I was stimulated to mention something about it, not only because we're coming, toward the deadline for registration, but I'm looking at my panel, and Deborah Richardson has been one of our featured speakers from year to year, and Helen has been one of our really star students, and we'll have to have you back as a guest speaker, Helen. But if you're interested in that program, either go to www.elnpno.org or pick up a brochure on the outside. I think it's a great program for high-level and aspiring nonprofit executives. So thanks again, everyone, for coming, and thank you for the contributions of the panel, and Deborah, and certainly Ambassador Joseph and his wife, who's accompanied him. I mentioned to them yesterday that I had the privilege, I don't remember how many years ago, to actually visit them while he was ambassador in South Africa. For a reception, and it was one of the thrills of my life, as he continues to be one of our leading lights in thinking through these issues. So thanks all for coming, and hope to see you again on a future occasion.